Got through a lot yesterday. We covered off on preference reviews, deep diving into those behind the scenes preferences that drive what you see in the system. We talked a bit about how to secure your data, stop people making changes to transactions in prior periods. Focused on efficiently entering the data, and then also looked at the reporting and the inquiry around the information that you've actually got within your Reckon accounts data file. Today, we're going to deep dive more into the area of file maintenance, look at the business branding and workflow functions that are within Reckon that can add a lot of value to the way you actually present your business to your customers and others. And we'll also look at some compliance pieces, and there's a couple of bonus extras towards the end. So we're going to now circle back to the workbook. We have got a disclaimer, same one as yesterday, so I won't waste any time reading on that. The workbook itself, hopefully you do have that and you have it open there. We're going to start on page 66 actually with answer sheet number 37. I know this gets a little confusing when I'm talking about answer sheet numbers and page numbers, but I'll try and actually focus more on page numbers for you if you're following along in the workbook. We'll skip a few pages here and there just because of the time constraints that we've got, but all of the hints and tips are there printed for you and you can access them. Just on the workbook itself, one thing you might want to do when you've brought it up on the screen, and as I said earlier, that password is Reckon with a capital R, 2021, to open it up. But you may also want to search it from time to time. So if you just click on the looking glass or the search button, I'll just type the word backup here. If I want to find everything there is to do with backups, then you can go searching through the actual document. It can take you to each time a backup is actually mentioned within the document. So that will be useful for future reference for you. So let's go into the program itself. We're going to spend the hour pretty much all in Reckon accounts. Now, whether you're using Reckon accounts desktop or hosted, won't matter. Virtually everything we're going through here today will be identical as to whether you're using hosted or your desktop application. So in Reckon accounts itself, we're back in the sample data file here that we've put together. Blank screen, just the home page that's actually open. So the first hints and tips I want to look at is on page 66 of the workbook. It's number 37 in the answer sheets. So how can I find out who actually entered a particular transaction and when? Often we want to work out, well, who actually entered that transaction and when did they actually do it? So if we look at a report, and I'll pick on the profit and loss, it's probably the simplest one. We're in there a fair bit, obviously. We'll look at last financial year. We'll say, okay. Now, if I wanted to sort of drill down into, we've got this area called software expense. I'll just double mouse click on that, and there's some transactions sitting in here. So this is a list view of transactions. Now, certain information is displayed, but you might want a little bit more than what you actually see on the screen here. So we can go to our modify report screen. All the columns that are ticked here on the left-hand side are those that are currently displayed. So if you didn't want to display a particular column, we could untick it and it will be removed from the view on the screen. And as I said yesterday, there's nothing you can muck up with a report or an inquiry in the system at all. But I do want to tick on who entered this transaction or last modified it and when did they actually do it. And now what it does is it brings another column into play here. So entered/last modified is the actual physical date and time, right down to the seconds, as to when this transaction was either entered or last modified. And that's who actually did it. So the admin user, I'm actually logged in as the admin user, so I've edited and modified or entered these transactions. Let's flip on over now to the next page, page 67. We can then also look a little bit deeper into this to see more a list of users by particular date range. So you might want to actually modify a report. We could go to a list report. So if I went into reports, list, let's say transaction or accountant, general ledger or a transaction detail by account, and you can actually see all the transactions that have been entered by a particular person. I'll just look at this financial year, just to keep it nice and simple. Now, obviously, these are all the transactions that have actually been entered. I can turn on that column again, entered and last modified by. I can then also go and I could display it to sort it by actual the columns at the moment by who was entered and last modified by. So who did the transaction, what date they actually did the transaction. This is just a by account, so by the various general ledger accounts as well. You could also display this just by actually a flat list of all the entries that have been entered by that particular person. The next thing I want to move on to is more around the whole file maintenance area. Now, for many of you, you've probably been using Reckon for many years, and your file tends to, because it holds all of the transactions that have ever been entered in the data file, it'll get bigger. Which, you know, in some cases you might find that it gets a little slower actually reporting or doing an inquiry. And in many cases, what we've found is that people are just not doing the maintenance that's required to actually make sure their file is running at its optimum. So when you have Reckon accounts open, if I just escape out of there to close down those screens, if you hit the Control key and the number 1 key on your keyboard, what it does is it brings up some product information. And it tells you essentially, well, where is this file actually stored? What is the file size? So this file size is 39,824K or kilobytes, or 39 meg. Pretty small file, really, in the grander scheme of things. We see files now up to sort of 2 gigabytes. So, or certainly hundreds of megabytes. So lots of transactions. There's only 4,000 transactions in this file. You may have tens of thousands of transactions. DB file fragments. If you're running on a desktop version of Reckon, we'd highly recommend that you've got that file fragment under around about 100. You know, once it starts getting over that, the file starts to be more fragmented and it gets slower and actually more ineffective in actually running reports and doing inquiries. We can also see on the right-hand side here RB. That stands for rebuild, so it tells us this is the last time a rebuild was done on this file. If you don't see RB in that version used column, it means you've never done a rebuild. And, you know, that can also be impacting the speed and performance of your actual data file. So there's some routines and processes to reduce the file fragments here. If you're on hosted, sometimes the hosted file fragments can be very large, but not affecting the speed and performance of the data file. Reckon are using AWS in Sydney to manage those servers, and just the fact that they are perhaps fragmented and just the sheer processing power that is in that data center environment, the file fragment number probably isn't that overly relevant. But certainly rebuilds need to have been done, and also verifications of data. So we talk about that on page 70. About actually how to maintain that process. I'm not going to run it all here right at the moment because it could take 10, 15, 20 minutes or a couple of hours actually to run that rebuild process. One thing I will say though is also it's a good policy to be doing a regular backup. And if I go into the file menu, save copy or backup, when you click on the backup copy option and we click on options, if you've got full verification turned on, what it does is when you do a full verification or complete verification when taking a backup, then it actually clears out what's known as a TLG or a transaction log file. And we're on page 71 of the workbook or answer sheet 330 here. Now the transaction log file, if I just jump into where our file is located here, and I'll actually just go into that actual directory, and I've got this folder here where my file is located. There's my file here, the QBW file, and I've got a file called the same name with a full stop and TLG. Very small. Sometimes though that transaction log file can be actually bigger than your data file, which actually will affect the performance of your file. So by doing a full backup with verification turned on, that transaction log file will actually get reset every time the full verification is turned on and the backup is created successfully. So that will actually help in your file actually performing better in the long run. If you need assistance with any of these file maintenance routines or some education or one-on-one training, we can certainly help or talk to your accredited partner actually about that. That's on page 72. We talk about the backup and verification settings. When you're doing a rebuild, I will tell you this, but under a caveat, on page 73, you can actually skip the backup if you're in the desktop environment by actually holding down the control key when you actually go to do a rebuild. I would not do it. I would never do that the first time I'm creating the backup, because if you are in the middle of a rebuild, you don't want the actual file breaking out on you, and if you have to restore and you don't have a backup, you could be in all sorts of trouble. So file, utilities, rebuild data, hold down the control key only after you'd already taken a backup, and that will skip that process and save up time, a lot of time for you actually going through the backup or the actual rebuild process. Let's move on to page 74 now. We're looking at how can I actually get a better view as to who owes me money at the time here. And if we go into the customer center, by default on the right-hand side here, and again, we can change columns here, we can change the width. All I'm doing is grabbing the mouse when it changes to that cross in the middle of the screen and moving my mouse left and right here. Likewise, you could change the column width here by doing exactly the same thing. We can shift things and reorganise them. But I want to know, out of the balance here, I've got Amstrad Builders, and on the right-hand side of the screen, I'm seeing all of their transactions. I just want to see what are the open invoices? What are the transactions that have not been paid yet? So you can click on this show, and at the moment it's all transactions showing. I want to just show the balance details. So just show me all those transactions actually that either have a balance or have not been applied to a transaction. Have not been applied to an actual payment. So you can then see just those transactions that are actually still outstanding. So if we click on invoices there, you can filter by all open invoices for all dates. And it'll just show us those $67,000 worth of open invoices. That's the total that they currently owe us. And these are the 3 transactions that are actually outstanding. Over on to page 75. There's a function called audit company file, and it's found in under the actual company file menu here under company, and we go down to actually audit company file, from the file menu, file audit company file. When I click on audit company file, it gives me a little bit of useful background information. It says, okay, this is the name of the file, this is where it's located, where we could see when we did Control 1, this is how big the file is. That's useful. But then if we click on Next, it tells us when the last backup was created, when the last verification was created, and we would recommend doing that if you ever get kicked out of the data file or an error occurs. Come back in and do a file, utilities, verify data. Just want to check that the file's hanging together okay, that there's no errors within the data file. It's not going to check your accounting or check your bookkeeping or your bank recs, but it will actually report on any errors found and then recommend a rebuild. If it does recommend a rebuild, certainly do 3 rebuilds in a row, and that tends to be the most effective way of actually, for the file resorting itself, then run a verification again after that. It also tells you when the closing date was set. I know we talked about that yesterday. If you need to go and set a date, if there's no date there, you can click on closing date and then go straight into the actual preference here to actually do that. The next screen also then, it just gave us a warning saying the verification is more than a week ago. It also tells us a snapshot as to when the last bank recs were done. Or, as you know in Reckon, you can reconcile not only bank accounts, but any balance sheet account. So we can see here that the last rec for the bank account was done on the 30th of June, the online clearing account back in 2009. And you can go and then reconcile from here if you wanted to. And so then you can run an audit company file that checks for things like, post-dated transactions, all sorts of exceptions as well. I'm not going to actually run that at the moment because it can take some time to actually run. Flip on over to page 77. We also do talk about a part of the maintenance routine process is actually creating a portable company file and restoring it. So under the file, save, copy or backup, you probably have noticed this portable company file. What it is it's a concentrated backup of your data file. And we usually use it a lot when we're sending files around in the old way of, perhaps emails. We don't tend to do that anymore. We file share through, OneDrive or through Dropbox or other sort of file sharing protocols. But the portable company file, now under instruction particularly, but if you could create a portable company file and restore it into a fresh location, and that does some file maintenance at the time of restoring. I'm not going to go into all the details there. It takes some time to do, but it's always a part of our maintenance routine if we're actually helping clients maintain a healthy data file, that particularly when the files get larger and perhaps slower. Head on over to page 79. This is about the look that you can actually create out of Reckon when you're sending information to your customers. And as you know, in the lists or templates here, there's a whole myriad of templates that we can use or do use in our Reckon Accounts software. Could be creating tax invoices, entering credit adjustment notes, sales receipts. You may be entering purchase orders, sales orders, quotes, estimates, delivery dockets, pay slips, obviously, and remittance advices you could customise to suit your business brand. We often get the question, this is on page 79 of the workbook, answer sheet number 313, is how can I make the template that comes out of Reckon look a lot more like a Word document? Not so static, not so many lines, not so invoice template looking, because the standard templates are very boxy to start with. So if I looked at a sales order here, and we've got all of these columns in here, if I'm looking at the actual, the view of this actual template, what you can do is we can go to this additional customization. And let's say I wanted to get rid of all of these columns. I just want it to show up more like a Word document, description, and then perhaps a total at the end. So I'm going to turn off. On the screen, you'd leave it, all these tick boxes, because that's data that you're entering. But the print column is what your custer actually gets to see. Do they need to see your item name? Not necessarily. Maybe they just want maybe they don't need to see a quantity. They don't even need to see the rate and the amount or the tax or the actual tax amount. So it's really just this box of description. And then we've got a total down the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Now, again, this template needs a bit of work still, but you can see how you can start modifying that customer-facing view, and you could then move into your layout designer and start moving, boxes around and actually, expanding that box, bringing it back across, and repositioning of it. We might delete customer message. We don't need that. And obviously drag and drop. If I want to drag a couple of fields here, I'm just going to hold down the Shift key, select both of those fields. I might want to move the ABN number, to somewhere else up the top there. Likewise, if I hold down the Shift key, we can select multiple fields at once and then just reposition them. It is a bit of a rainy day job customising templates, but if you get it right, then it actually can start to complement your business and look a lot more like you. One thing I would recommend is putting a logo, because we tend to email documents more, obviously, these days, but put your brand on there. So the way to do that is if actually I go back and we'll say okay to that, back in this front screen when we're editing the template, we click on Select Logo and just choose a logo, your logo, bitmap, JPEG, image, and I can go to Layout Designer. You can select multiple logos as well, because then in here we can add another image in addition to that image that's already actually included there, and reposition it wherever it is that we want to position it. So you might put, there could be some terms and conditions, for example, if you want to, that you've got scanned as a JPEG or a bitmap image, and you can position them at the bottom of the field, which gives you a lot more text information than you can actually utilise by just using the custom fields that are there, or the standard fields. You can add a text box, so you can just type in free-form text of any sort, and position that wherever you want to as well. Might be BSB and account banking details, for example, on the document. That's on page 81, so when we're looking at actually moving the template around, inserting perhaps a disclaimer as well, and the logos. Once you've got your template sort of modified, and you may start with your tax invoice, I've just started with that sales order there. If you've got a layout that you're sort of quite happy with, that's our standard now for our business, and you want to then replicate that layout across the rest of your templates, you can what's known as duplicate. So we can right mouse click and duplicate that layout, being a sales order, to a tax invoice. Now, obviously, all the fields won't be the same, but the general look and feel, if I say OK there, now it's created a copy of that sales order layout. And then you can come in here. Now, this is an actual tax invoice now. If we go into the additional customization and we can start changing the name or the layout type, and we'll call it, actually call it tax invoice. We'll just continue there. We've just got invoice number. And just to change the relevant wording there so it actually appears on the document. So it gives you a starting point. We'll just continue there to say, okay. It gives you that starting point to actually continue on with perhaps some further modification, but you haven't had to actually go and create all this from scratch because we've actually duplicated a layout that you've already have designed. Let's head on over now to page 86. We're talking about printing or emailing a payslip on page 106. Probably many of you are already doing this. We do get questions around clients, especially when you first set up the data file. If I looked in the Employee Centre, all of the employees, or let's say a new employee that you set up, doesn't show up when you actually want to email that actual payslip. What's important is that in the Employee Centre here, under the address info, that we actually have preferred send method to perhaps either both or email if you just want to email them. Otherwise, if you don't have both or email there, when you go to file, send forms or select forms to email payslips, that individual employee will not show up, no matter whether you've selected the right date range, the right bank account, and also chosen your layout. They just won't show up in here because you don't have either both or email selected in their master file. Another question that comes up from time to time is when you're trying to email a document, the system's actually trying to get you to confirm that you want to email it each and every time you want to send it. So if you go into your edit preferences, and we're on page 88 of the workbook here, and we'll go into this online section under the preferences. There's this tick box that says display each email before sending. In most cases, make sure that's turned off. I know for some of you, you might want to capture it and edit it and make changes before sending, but in many cases, you would just simply have that unticked. So if you're having that problem where it's crashing out on you, it's trying to get you to respond to a pop-up or something that says, hey, do you want to have a look at this before you send it every time, then it's probably that tick box that you need to actually untick. Just on emailing of a document, again, when you first set up Reckon, I would suggest take a little bit of time, or now go back and edit the wording that actually flows with the email. So if I go into this area under Edit Preferences, and I've got this area called Send Forms, and in under Company Preferences here, we've actually got a list of all the documents that can be emailed out of or sent out of Reckon. So to, you might say dear, or any sort of narration that you want to put in there. First name, perhaps, first name, last name looks a bit odd, perhaps. The subject, now relatively new, is this area called tags. So over on the right-hand side here, you could put invoice, and then we could actually insert a tag being transaction number. And when I type that transaction number, being the invoice number, will actually appear in the subject line when that's being emailed to your customers. You can insert that in the body down here as well. So there's a number of tags. You can click on that click here button to actually go and look for them as well. So we use that all the time now with clients because it's a little bit more descriptive. That's the invoice number. I can see it in the header, and that shows up in the subject line. So make sure this wording is aligned to your way of speaking with your customers. and not just the standard text that's perhaps been set up here. You know, you can put other information in here like an email address at the base or the web address or something you want to talk to your customers about by modifying this actual template within your company preferences here. Let's actually now move over to page 93. We want to explore our reports a little bit more. We want to look at our sales by customer, but not just for 1 year. Let's have a look at the last 5 years. And I'm really just showing this as an example again of the powerful reporting engine within Reckon. We went to reports and we said, okay, show me the sales by customer summary. And if I said here, let's have a look from maybe, we won't say all dates, but we'll go back quite a number of years. And we'll go back from the 1st to the 7th, 18 to 30th of the 6th, 21. I'm going to say, okay, display these columns. By default, it's just total only. I want to then change that view to change the columns to be displayed by year. Oh, we've only got 3 years worth of history in here. But then you can actually then sort that by default, or we can sort it by the total. By customer, ascending or descending, so you can see the most sales by customer at the top of the screen there. You might want to modify that report and show it as a percentage of the overall column. We'll say okay to that, and you can see that the top customer here is 14.3% of our total sales. In fact, the top 3 customers is around 40% of our total sales. So the 80-20 rule starts to work out there. You could send that to Excel and actually do some further deep dives or calculations or even graph that information. The next thing I want to drill into is actually setting up budgets, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on this one because what I've found over the last 25 years of educating small businesses in using accounting technology and software is that probably only 2%, maybe 3% of small businesses actually have a budget that they've set up and are actively monitoring. So what I've found is if what you said is what you get, I'm going to really just quickly go into this. There's probably more of a deep dive session that we could do around this with you on how to actually manage and monitor and report and so forth and design the budgets. But I wanted to actually show you how quickly it is to set one up. So if I go into this company menu up here and we go to planning and budgets and set up budgets. Now, what I've got in here is actually, I've got 3 budgets set up, very, very old ones. I want to create a new budget because we've had sort of 10 years of not using budgets in this file. Over on the right-hand side, I'm just going to create a new budget. I want to create it for the 2021-22 year, the year that we're currently in, and it's just a profit and loss budget. You can create it by customer or class or just whole of business. So we'll say whole of business here. Do you want to create it from scratch? Or what about if we created a budget based on last year's actuals data? Whole lot easier than starting from scratch. I'm not a fan of scratch. So if we click finish there, what the system does is it actually goes and grabs all the information that's happened in the last 12 months and rolls it into a budget for the 2021-22 year. Now, obviously, there's some things down the bottom here, particularly that are not going to happen again, like cash flow boost. And so I'm just blanking that out. And I'm then selecting the copy across button. I might make that a little bit more in the middle of the screen so you can actually see what I'm doing here. So I'm going to copy that blank across, so it just removes them all. And I'll do the same on JobKeeper because we know that's not coming back. You may also want to then modify this budget. We could run a session on deep diving into more of that, but essentially I'm looking at here and saying, okay, well, let's have a look at some income for contractors. I'll copy that across, or I'll adjust that row amount. I'll increase it by 10% per month, and I'm going to select that current month and I'm going to compound it. So that'll actually compound it every month, month on month throughout the year. There might be some things that you don't have, or maybe rent's gone to $3,000 a month, copy that across. You get the gist. So if we say okay then, we've set the budget. We can then go and run a report, budgets and forecast, budget overview, and look at the budget for the year. And we'll say this financial year, and we'll say okay. Collapse that down. There's the budget that I've just entered. Still a bit sick looking, not many sales at the top there, and we've got a big loss at the end. Then you can start reporting on, well, how are we going versus actual? So profit and loss budget versus actual. Whoops. Reports, budgets, budget versus actual. Show me how we're going so far this year compared to what we planned for. I'll collapse that down. And I'm just going to display that for the total of that period. So we can now start seeing, and again, we don't have much activity in this data file, but it can start reporting how we're going compared to actuals and budget. If you've already got a budget, some people ask us, well, I've had a go at setting one up. How do I actually get rid of that one and start again? So when you go to company planning and budgeting, set up budgets. When you've got the budget actually open on the screen, it's a little bit cryptic, but there's a way of getting rid of it. You can go to edit and delete budget. Control D will remove that budget and say, are you sure you want to delete it? It's gone. And now we can start from afresh to create a new budget. There's graphs and all sorts of other things that you can actually produce there as well. But what we found just on that is what you set is actually what you get. The businesses that are doing probably the best that we've seen over the last 25 years are the ones that actually set a target and monitor their performance in moving towards that. Another thing that we do get asked around budgets particularly is, can I report across calendar year or seasons, different to just a financial year? You certainly can. So what you can do is go up to edit, company preferences, and we're on page 95 of the workbook, company information. By default, your system is probably set up to be financial year reporting, July starting year. You could change that to actually January temporarily, and we can say okay to that. And then now when we come to, create a budget, it's actually going to go for the January to December period. And so create your budget, set it in place, create your budget reports, memorize those, and then you can come back and actually go back into that preference under your company information screen and set that back to July. And that will hardwire those budgets, if you've memorised them, to actually report across that calendar year rather than a financial year. Page 97, we talk about the budget versus actual graph and how to report on that as well. Deleting a budget's on page 98. Let's move through to page 100. We've already done that, duplicating templates. Page 101, displaying an item's custom field information. Now I'll touch on this because it's actually, you've got the ability to set up 7 additional custom fields in both customers or suppliers or even payroll and items for that matter. So I'm going to use the example here. I've got an item list and we've got a lot of inventory items in this data file. I've also got under this area called custom fields. And at the moment, we don't have anything displaying here. So I'm going to actually create my own custom field. I'm going to create a label. So in this case, we can actually use 5 in the item list. This label is, bin location for that actual product. We'll say OK to that, and we'll just say Y2C and say OK. So now, if I want to see that being displayed in my list, for example, but you can right mouse click, customize those columns. We looked at this in the first session. Now down the bottom of the screen here, we've got bin location as an actual selection. We'll click on add there. I actually also might want to just move that up to be sitting next to the what we've got on hand. And now we can see that we've got this column that says actual bin location. Same applies for customers. We may actually want to grab some additional information about the customer. We've got marketing campaign there, but you might go to define fields and you can set another half a dozen or so that can be tagged to particularly the customers or suppliers as well in there and reported on. Page 102, we talk about printing a stamp on an invoice to showing that it's actually been paid. So I'll actually I'll look at all transactions here. I'll go into a payment. I'll just go to Control H there to look at the invoice. Control H brings up the history of it we looked at yesterday. Show me the invoice. It's got this word that says paid across the actual invoice. So if you wanted to print or email that, you can have the stamp being paid sitting on there. One thing to consider is if you, last couple of versions, if the account is overdue, the overdue stamp is actually going to appear on this particular invoice. And I think I might have one here. Here, this one. So this was due on the 30th of July. It hasn't been paid yet, so the word overdue is actually showing up on here. So if you do send it or email it, that overdue word is going to sit right across the top of your document. Maybe you don't want that being sent to your customers like that. I know Reckon are looking at a way to get around that. We haven't actually seen that in a release just yet. Page 104, we're looking then at using and tidying up perhaps our reminders list. Now your reminders and to-dos you can set within Reckon. So what I will do here is actually, it's all under this company menu, to-do list and reminders. So we'll look at the reminders first. These typically are things that pop up when you first open up the program, which you can actually set as a preference just to show you the reminders. In fact, if I go into Edit Preferences, and when we first actually open the file, you can actually have the reminders actually appearing. So I'm going off script here, so I better just find out where that actually is. Where is the reminders? Here, there we are. So you can actually have any number of these to be set to remind you, or just show the actual list itself, or a summary, or don't remind me at all, and set the rule around how often that would be displayed. So if you tick that, then you've got these reminders here. Now you might have a case where you've just got a stack of reminders that you just want to get rid of. So we've got all these memorised transactions due. That's probably fair enough, things that are coming from our memorised transaction list. But there's all purchase orders to print. If you've got them in here, you think, oh, no, I don't want those. You may go and just untick to be printed down in the bottom left-hand corner here and save and close that transaction. If it's before the closing date, you'd need to enter that password. Or you just go and simply print them all. So File, Print Forms, select Forms to print, and you might have, and if I look at invoices here, I've got 61 that are perhaps very old. You can go and tick all the old ones and just print them to a PDF, just to get rid of them out of the system. If you've got a lot of checks as a classic, you know, in the old days, people tended to tick checks to actually print. Look at that, got a stack of them there. We don't need that. So then you could just go and run them as a PDF and clear them out. To-do notes, as setting the reminders outside of just the standard system ones, you can go into company to-do notes, and down the bottom of the screen here we can create a new one. BAS due on 28 October. Remind me on a certain date beforehand, and I'll just say okay to that. So that'll appear now in your reminders as to-do notes, and then obviously you can come in here and mark it as done when in fact you want to actually mark it as complete. That's page 105, 106. Another thing we do get asked, on the home page here, you may see your bank balances actually showing up on the right-hand side of the screen. If you don't want that to display, certainly for certain users, you may not want that being shown, depending on their preferences. What you can do is actually go into your Edit Preferences, and in under the desktop view here, we've got these company preferences. We make sure that Show Account Balances on the home page is actually unticked. I will tick it just to sort of show you what actually does happen here, and we'll go back to the home page there. Top right-hand corner, you can actually see the balances of our bank accounts. Go back into the preferences and the desktop view, untick those and say okay. While I'm actually in here, the other thing too is if you've got multiple company files, you might also want to change the colour scheme, and they've got various choices here. So the background, I might change this to blue, for example. So that just immediately changes the look of this data file. It's a visual way of telling you that you're in a different company file than perhaps your normal one. And it's a flag to actually, you know, make you stop and think, oh yeah, I am in the other entity. We find a lot of people actually don't mind that for distinguishing between multiple company files. Let's now head on over to page 112. We've got in a lot of detail actually in here in creating an ABA file, paying suppliers electronically. I know many of you on the call would be actually doing that, but we still find a lot of people that actually create the payment in Reckon and then actually go onto their bank website and type in the amounts that they're paying their suppliers or their employees. So all of that can be automated to actually create what's known as an ABA file out of Reckon, and then export and upload that file into your banking software as a multiple funds transfer. It eliminates the potential for rekeying errors and also saves you a heck of a lot of time if you're actually setting up BSB and account numbers for suppliers within Reckon. So I'm just looking at a supplier here. Let's click on A. James Glass. There's this tab called Bank Details. So you're just keying in specifically the account number and the branch code, but also I'd recommend using the lodgement reference. And we'll just do, we've got QA Enterprises as the business name, because that actually is what's going to show up on the bank statement for your supplier. So once you've done that, you do need to then make sure that you have an online enabled bank account. We talk about this in the hints and tips here. Within your chart of accounts, you can see these ones got little lightning bolts on them. So if I right mouse click and go to edit, on the clearing account here, we've got our online bank account details. If you're unsure of the APCA number for you and your bank, you can just put all zeros and we'll save and close that. And then when we come to pay a bill, we actually simply select the supplier that we want to pay. Down the bottom of the screen here, we say, okay, I want to bank online, and we select that supplier that we actually want to pay via that way. And when you create that bill, if I pay that bill, then we can come into this online banking area, and I've probably got heaps actually sitting in here, so this could take a while to open. In fact, I've got stacks sitting in here that I haven't cleaned out, so this could take ages. There they all are. So it'll be sitting in here. Anything you haven't uploaded or exported in readiness to upload to your bank, and you can see that one right down the bottom there that we've just done. So I'm going to actually select none here. I'm going to select that one at the bottom. And then we could preview that ABA file. Here's the details of what we're going to send to our bank. And then I can create the ABA file, save it, and then upload it to your bank. In a nutshell, there's probably a little bit more around that in protocols, but that we step you through that on pages 112, 13. And for employees, it's the same. For page 114, 115, we've got that there as well. Definitely worth doing if you haven't done it already. Talk to us or your accredited partner on actually how to actually make sure that's all configured to do it. Emailing supplier remittances, relatively new in the software over the last few years. When you pay a supplier, once you've paid them, if they've got an email address set up, and also in that supplier, if you've actually got them set up to be, where are we there? To actually be able to be emailed, then we need to actually, if there's an email address in there, then we can actually email it a supplier remittance. So select forms to email, supplier remittance. Again, you may want to, that's the one we just processed. You may want to customise a supplier remittance to be more in line with your business. So what you can do is under the templates here, we've got a standard one, supplier remittance, and it's pretty basic. No logo. I can right mouse click and I'll actually duplicate, and we'll create then another one where we can insert the logo, for example, and we'll say okay to that. And then when we go to send that supplier remittance, we can then simply choose that layout. And if I just preview that, there's the logo sitting on the supplier remittance. A little bit of customizing that you can actually do there. Emailing pay slips, we talk about that, very similar process there. The employee needs to be set up so that we actually have the ability to send the form as both, a bit like the customers earlier. Make sure it's either both or email, otherwise you won't get the option to email the pay slip for them. Page 120, we talk about payroll schedules. If you have groups of employees, that are sort of grouped together, might be on a schedule of weekly or some are fortnightly, or it's the executive pay run. Under the payroll area here, what we can do is actually add a payroll schedule. And so we've got set up here weekly or monthly. You might create a new one, and it could be for fortnightly. And select the next date that the fortnight ends and what date is the actual payment date going to happen. And so it says it's been set up, and you can assign employees to this. We just go to their payroll and compensation info tab. So if I go into the employee and I look at Betty here, payroll and compensation info. At the moment, her schedule is weekly, but if we change that, her frequency is weekly. If we said fortnightly, that will change the pay frequency. So now she will actually appear on the fortnightly schedule, and only her, because she's the only one that we've tagged as a fortnightly scheduled pay. Let's head on over to page 123, sticking with payroll a little bit here. A very common report that you produce, certainly at end of BAS period, end of pay-as-you-go withholding, or even end of financial year, is your payroll summary report. So if I go to employees and payroll, we go to payroll summary. By default, if we look at last payroll year here, it actually lists all the employees across the page. Now, we've got a few extra columns here. We may not need to worry about seeing their hours or their rates, so we can tick off both of those. But again, you might have more than 10 employees and you just can't see them all on the one page. And I just want to see the total anyway. So you can change this column view, scroll up to total. And this will just give you a concise total value, not displayed by employee. You can still go back to employee, you could display it by quarter. There's a whole myriad of ways you can actually display it. Another option obviously then is going to employees and payroll totals report. Last year, we go to last payroll year, then that lists down the page. So again, it's probably a better report for those that have got more than, say, 10 employees, if you want to see the individual totals by employee. Again, for those of you using payroll, I'll just touch on another section here on page 124 that talks about the leave liability report. So who do we owe leave to? And a lot of small businesses still don't have leave set up and tracking properly in Reckon, so we see that a lot. Leave can be tracked, annual leave, personal leave, RDOs can actually be tracked, long service leave to a point. There's a bit of a caveat on that, but you can certainly set up to 4 leave types. There's 2 by default to start with, the annual leave and personal leave, and we've got 2 extras that we can actually use as well. So when we go to payroll totals, when we go to leave totals here, and I'm just going to go to reports, employees and payroll, and leave liability report. So I'll say OK to that. By default, this doesn't have a date, so you can't choose on a range. This is as of the last pay, when the last pay was processed. So I'm changing these columns around a bit. This is a report you probably should customise and then memorise. Now, I'm going to change a few of these column widths. I can see that we've got a total for holiday and we've got a total for long service, but I don't have a total for personal leave here. So I'm going to modify this report, scroll down and turn on the personal dollar column and say OK to that. I then want to move the personal dollar value over next to the personal available, and actually we'll flick through there as well. If you've got a situation where someone isn't showing up in here and they're a current employee, then you might find that, and if I look at, say, Muriel, she's still active, payroll and compensation info. Yep. If I go to leave liability report here and look at this particular employee, there's a few things that could be going on. We might find that under the leave details that she just has got 0 in here and therefore leave won't accrue, or this box is not ticked, leave liability in the bottom left hand corner. Make sure that's ticked, and that means that it will actually display So we can see the dollar value now showing up for her and the hours actually in there as well. We talk a lot more about that on pages 125 and 126 as well. When you're producing your BAS, we get a few calls every time. Sometimes when an upgrade is done, you may lose your BAS settings. Doesn't seem to happen as much as it used to, but if you're trying to work out, well, what tax codes should I have attached to the various boxes on my BAS, just simply go to your Reports, Tax, Simplified BAS. And then from within there, you've got this little question mark box here. And on the right-hand side, it says put GST, INP, EXP and FRE in that particular box. So we just click on the G1, FRE, GST, INP if you've got it, and then EXP. And then it pre-populates the figures. Now I don't have a date range, any transactions in this file for the period of October as yet. Also, one tip, when you roll around to the start of a calendar year, sometimes this date doesn't update here. So make sure that the current year is, in fact, this is the year that we're actually working in. Quarter beginning, and it's beginning July 2021, and just check that date there, because sometimes that might be last year's actual date. Pages 129 through to sort of 133, we talk a lot at 134, we talk a lot about how to process your BAS payment and your BAS refund. Again, I won't go into the detail on that, but I just wanted to include it in there because it's a way of actually doing what's known as a BAS journal. And we also run a BAS webinar workshop, so maybe that if you haven't attended that, would be useful for you. But it's actually, we see people enter their BAS payment as a supplier. We see them do all sorts of weird and wonderful ways of actually processing the BAS. They split it up through 2 payments, all those sorts of things. But essentially, if you follow the methodology on pages 129 to 135, it'll walk you through how we would recommend setting up and processing your BAS journal at the end of each BAS period. Again, talk to us more or your advisor around that if you want one-on-one assistance. At the end of the financial year, when you're giving your work to your accountant, a couple of things they actually need, and that can make their life a whole lot easier and hopefully save you some fees when they're actually doing your end of year work. What they need to get from you is actually a profit and loss and a balance sheet movement report. They'll need more information than that, obviously, but essentially they want to know, well, what's happened for the year in a numbers point of view by looking at this data file. So the way to do that, and we talked about yesterday actually setting up the general ledger account codes, the numbers, to align to your accountant's system, so that's useful. But if you run your profit and loss, obviously, for last financial year, and just you may want to collapse it or just expand it, gives them all the detail there. That's certainly one report. That's one half of your business equation, really, your net profit. But the other side is the movement in the balance sheet. So if I go to Reports, Company and Financial Balance Sheet, Previous Year Comparison, and if I look at last financial year, and we've got these columns turned on, previous year, dollar change and percentage change. I'll probably turn off the percentage change. But this column, the dollar change column, shows, well, okay, if at June 2020, these were the final numbers. Hopefully they align to your accountant's figures, but in a lot of cases they don't because you haven't balanced your system to theirs. Now that's a whole nother topic, but this dollar change column is the movement from one year to the next. Now the bottom right-hand corner there, we can see 767. I'll bring that up for you a little bit, with the profit and loss sort of sitting beside us here. I'll just close that out for one moment. So the profit and loss, if we scroll down to the bottom, we've got $776,000. So the other side of that, for accountants on the call, debits equal our credits, we've got 767, 788.84. So this is your movement journal for the year, the dollar change column and the P&L for that actual year, which will make it a lot simpler for you to get the system figures out of Reckon into your financial preparation or tax preparation software that you use at the end of the year. Let's flip back. We're on to page 136 here. Another tip that I just want, especially for those of you that are doing a lot of quotes or estimates in the system, That's obviously optional. I mean, it's a non-financial transaction. If you go into edit preferences, you can turn them on, and we actually, we can turn on quotes and estimates and all of those sorts of things, depending on your preferences here. So we can actually enable sales orders, enable quotes, all of those things. So if I say OK to that, if I've turned on an estimate or quote, so I've got estimates here, you may have an estimate that you do regularly. It's standard. You've got a lot of wording and template and information that you think, oh, I've done that quote before. I've got a similar job coming up. How can I just copy or duplicate that quote? There's two ways of doing it. One is you could memorize, right mouse click and memorize the estimate. But when you're in estimates or quotes, you can also duplicate the estimate. So when I hit duplicate here, it actually duplicates that transaction, and then you can just choose the customer that you actually want to now assign that quote to with all the existing details from the other customer. Memorizing, if you think, well, okay, this is a handy estimate, I want to memorize it. Well, actually not for estimates so much, but more so, let's say we've got an invoice, and I'm going to, so I want to memorize that. So we can actually right mouse click and memorize that tax invoice, and we can set it up. Don't remind me, perhaps. I'll just go searching for it, and this could just be a window invoice standard. Sales orders and quotes are probably more regularly done this way. And then, therefore, if you want to actually create that, we just need to go to List, Memorize Transaction List, and down the bottom here we can see we've got Windows Invoice Standard. I'm going to double click on that and say yes, do that. Just got a couple of warnings there. Our quantities are going in a negative in this sample file. And then we can choose, okay, which customer do I actually want to do that invoice for? You still may modify that template and change it, but at least the lion's share of the setup is already done for you. We'll just escape out of there. A couple more things I want to go through just to round out. And you might have noticed it just there was a thing called pending invoices. So when I went to invoices and I went to previous, we had this thing called pending actually tagged there. Now, if you're doing an invoice and you're just building on it over a month, you might just be continually working on a job, and you're going to, instead of raising small invoices throughout the month, you might just finalise at the end of the month. So some people use right mouse click on an invoice and mark it as what's known as pending. And therefore, at the end of the month, you can then say, well, I'll right mouse click now and mark as final. So think of it just like a scratch pad or a job or a work order or something that you're actually filling out over time. They're non-posting whilst they're pending, so the GST is not going to flow through, your figures are not going to flow through to your profit and loss or your BAS or anything like that until such time as you finalise it. One thing I'd just say, if you're going to mark it as final, make sure you update the date to the current BAS period that you're actually in. Because you don't want that transaction modifying a BAS period already been finalised. We also then, at the end of the workbook, 142, we've got the closing date again. We've just said, okay, let's set the closing date. And I know we talked about this earlier, but if we go into company, set closing date, make sure you finalise this, because everyone should be setting this at least on a BAS period basis. There really shouldn't be any excuse for that, because this will stop changes or transactions being modified accidentally or deliberately in the financial period that's already closed off. And you can lock it down completely so nothing can get changed once you've set that closing date. And we'd recommend setting a password as well. If you forget that password, you can override it. It's no problem. If you're an admin user, you can just change it. You don't even have to know what that is if you can't remember it. Not like your admin password in the actual data file. So that's modifiable if you're the admin actual user. One other thing which is relatively new that I just wanted, it's not in the workbook, but I actually did want to touch on, is this notion of using what's known as links. So when in a transaction now, in the latest version of Reckon, we've got this thing called links at the top of the screen here. And what you can do in any transaction, you can set a link. So if we click on Add, we might want to do terms and conditions, or T's and C's. And you could then enter either the link information, so type physical words in there, or type in the reference to a link on your website or somewhere else where that actual data can be actually obtained. And now that note or link is going to be always attached to this particular transaction. Likewise, if with a bill or a tax invoice, you might want to have the links actually set up so that it refers to maybe a copy of the invoice or the document itself where you've stored it on your server or on your actual cloud storage. So we can actually do that by actually setting that link information in there as well. I'll close all these windows down, Windows close all, and we won't save that one. And we'll get back to our home page. That is the 2 hours. That hour went really quick. I'm sure it did for everyone else. I know I can talk quite quickly, but you've got the workbook. You'll have the recording of the webinars as well.